Hi, Photo Fisher here. In this video, I'll explain how to make my Backpacker's Pot Stove 1.0. It's extremely compact, portable, stable, and sturdy. Innovations for this classic design were inspired by many other YouTube videos out there, so my appreciation goes to them for inspiring me to take a look at this and maybe adding a few touches of my own to make it a little better. When designing the Backpacker's pot stand, I wanted it to satisfy several considerations. First, I wanted it to use one material. I didn't want any extra parts holding the legs together; those could get lost or broken in the field. I wanted it to be maintenance free, and since it's just wire, it certainly is maintenance free. I wanted it to be lightweight. One leg weighs approximately 9 grams. I wanted it to be extremely stable, and if it tips over, doesn't fall apart. I want it to be able to withstand high temperatures. Since it's steel wire, it can do so. If this were aluminum wire, it would deform over time. And I wanted it to be packable. Breaking it down, it certainly is. To make the Backpacker's pot stove, you'll need a sturdy vise, an 8 or 9 gauge steel rod or nail. You'll need 14 gauge multi-purpose wire. Here I have a 100-foot spool for about $8 at your local hardware store. A hammer, a file, some wire clippers, and needle nose pliers all in one, a marker, and a jig to bend the stand legs at appropriate length. I'll get into this in a little bit. I have found the overall best length of each leg is approximately 4 inches, making a triangle that will hold a small pot or a large pot or a pan over your burner. To accomplish this, I built a jig 4 inches from this screw to this screw, and I put a little screw in here to help us bend the metal at a right angle, and I'll show you how this is used in a second. Let's look at what one leg looks like completed. On the connecting side, I have 2 coils of 6 wraps each. That is 1/2 inch. Okay. This is 4 inches, and this leg is equidistant to this section. You can make this section taller or shorter based upon the height of the pot stand you'll need. I'll show examples of this later. For a 3-inch high pot stand, you'll need approximately 22 inches of wire. For a 2.5-inch high pot stand, you'll need approximately 20 inches of wire. And in this demonstration, I'm building a 2-inch high pot stand, which will need about 18 inches of wire. Cut the section of wire necessary for the height of pot you're building. I always cut just a shade extra. Place the bending rod in the vise, sticking up about 1 inch or 1.5 inches. Notice that I've filed the edges around the top, and I've polished the shank with steel wool to make sliding the coils on and off easier. We start by bending the bottom coil. We do 6 wraps, which equals 1/2 inch using 14 gauge wire. Place about 1/4 inch, maybe 3/8 inch of the wire used to build your pot stand, and bend it forward. Then take a hammer and make that 90-degree bend very acute, very sharp. just like that. Place it back in, and we can start bending our first of our 6 wraps. Don't worry if they aren't touching, we can compress that in just a second. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Take the bending pin out of the vise and remove the coil. Now we'll want to trim this piece off using our wire snips. I try to get that as close to possible to the coil as I can, and if it's not close enough we can file it down even further. Alright, next put this in the vise right at the very edge and compress it. With the first coil in the vise right at the edge, flush with the edge of the vise, bend this forward. Again, take a hammer and make that angle 90 degrees. Slide the first coil back on the straightening pin, noticing this is the length of the shank of the straight part of our leg, and this is where the second coil begins. I allow enough room to bend 6 turns on the straightening pin, or the bending pin rather. I'll put that right there so that that red mark is right at the level of the vise. Then we'll just bend it down, make sure that that angle is a perfect 90 degrees, and we begin bending the second coil. Notice by putting the first coil on the bending rod, it helps you align the second coil with the first coil. This is actually the pot stand top, and we'll bend this down to make the legs itself. Remove the coils from the bending rod. Place the second coil that we just built in the vise to compress it. Don't compress it too far, just enough to keep the coils tight. Check for alignment. Now I have my first coil, my second coil, and I've straightened this out reasonably straight, enough to make the pot stand top and the leg. This is where the jig comes into play. Put that in here, make sure that this is tight against this screw, and I bend this around like that. After taking the leg out of the bending jig, you notice that this is rounded, and we'll want to square this off. Simply put this in the vise, clamp it down, to make more of a square angle. Straighten this up, check alignment, looks pretty straight. And we cut this leg to length. Once the 3 sections are completed, it's easy to put it together. There's the completed stand. The backpacker's pod stand can be constructed to accommodate different heights of stoves. Here a short penny type stove or small pressure stove requires only about a 2-inch pot stand. This gives you about an inch of space between the burner and the pot bottom surface. Here, a slightly taller burner requires about a 2.5 inch pot stand to give that inch space. And finally, a taller burner requires about a 3-inch pot stand to give about an inch space between the pot bottom and the flame bottom. Debate exists whether a 3-legged pot stand is sturdy enough to hold a larger pot or a heavy pot. Well, pretty easy to fix. Just make another leg, assemble it, and put your pot on top. Easy enough. Another add-on modification that I've employed is making a small windscreen out of an aluminum boiler pan. Here I've covered 3 sides. This piece of aluminum will satisfy a 3-legged or a 4-legged pot stand and allow enough air intake so that the burner doesn't extinguish. Here you can see the backpacker's pot stand, a small soda can stove, windscreen, all fits in a 2.5 cup titanium pot, leaving room for a striker match and some fuel. Put the lid on top of it. The entire thing weighs 200 grams. The backpacker's pot stand can easily hold a small pan, a large pan, even a skillet with no problem. It's quite sturdy, compact, portable, and stable. The backpacker's pot stand.